Thank you very much, Antoinette.
Thank you so much for having me today. I started off as like a volunteer for different environmental organizations when I was 15. So I was already really engaged. It's like 16 years ago. And then ever since then, the issues I care about has only grown. So there's other issues that I volunteer and spend my time on, like healthcare, education. But for work, I was lucky enough to get a position with the Sierra Club Rio Grande chapter 2 months before I graduated with my master's degree. My background is in anthropology, sustainable development, and applied economics. I like to look at things holistically. I mostly work on air pollution and oil and gas waste. So that's like things like produced water and um, methane, ozone, VOCs. And then I also spend a bit of my time working on other issues. Anytime something comes up in the southern half of New Mexico or the El Paso area, I'm the person that supports the volunteers. So I'm also working on, there's an effort to get a new national monument in Deming. I do some work around the border wall, humanitarian aid, and wildlife issues, among other topics.
Thank you.
Okay. So here's my contact information. I can also share it in the chat later on. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. So methane is probably what I spend more than half of my time on. I've been working on methane since 2019 or so. So I've really gotten to watch it evolve. And for some of you, if you aren't too familiar, methane is the primary component of natural gas. It's the second most potent driver of climate change. Its climate disrupting effect is 86 times that of CO2 over a 20-year time frame. And the most recent IEA study found that methane is responsible for 30% of the planet's warming since the Industrial Revolution. And that's contributed to more drought and wildfires across the West. And I'll also apologize. It's very text heavy. I didn't get too many graphics in here. So to go over methane emissions, I'm going to go from the global level down to the state level. On a global scale, so on the left is the main sources of methane related to human activities. So they have agriculture, energy at large, and then waste. So that could be stuff like landfills and similar things. And then on the right is through forecasting the sectors of how much they think that they're able to reduce or clean up those sectors. And they found that fossil fuels, which is about 35% of total human activity related methane emissions, has the most potential to reduce the most near-term abatement of methane emissions. So the IEA is attributing that half of methane emission cuts can come from oil, gas, and coal. They also have so it's the International Energy Administration, I believe. Their net zero emissions by 2050 scenario requires no new oil and gas projects approved for development, nor no new coal mines or life extensions. And they also believe that the only way to get to net zero by 2050 is to triple the investment of installed capacity of clean energy sources, to double energy efficiency, and to reduce fossil fuel methane emissions by 75%, with a third of that coming from demand and then 2/3 coming from leak detection and repair, no flaring, and those types of things. So at the national level, US methane emissions come from various sectors. On the left, this is a graphic from the EPA and the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, and this goes through 2022. So I pulled out some of these. So decaying landfills is about 16% of it, with over half of the methane from landfills being attributed to food waste. And then a quarter of US methane emissions from agriculture and livestock, And just as an example, I included some of the species that they included: cattle, swine, sheep, and goats. And that's what they're calling the enteric fermentation. And then oil and gas development is 28%. And at the New Mexico state level, these are the greenhouse gas. These are the emissions by sector according to the New Mexico Interagency Climate Change Task Force report of 2020, where a little over half of the emissions in the state are attributed to oil and gas. And if we're just looking at methane, oil and gas is about 60% of the state's methane emissions. And then this is just kind of a breakout of, this is from an NMED report of the different basins, and 98% of it comes from the two larger ones, San Juan and Permian. Then there's a little bit of drilling in smaller parts of the state. And this, the CH4 is the methane emissions, then the CO2 is the carbon emissions. So it, in case people are interested, you can see that there is more CO2 emissions in the San Juan Basin. So that's more, which is kind of a little ironic because that one is more of a gas basin, whereas the Permian is more of an oil basin. And that one, well, I guess both of them have more CO2 than methane, but the percentages are a little different. And then last fall, the Environmental Defense Fund did an analysis of the 2019 executive order that the Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham had written to address the climate goals for our state. And they found that we're likely going to achieve less than a third of the 45% reduction by 2030. And this is kind of a little breakout of, they included our past emissions and projected emissions, as well as some of the actions that have been taken. And then, so when it comes to industry, which is what I'm going to talk about from this point forward, there's a few different ways that emissions come out into, so there's leaks. So that could just be like faulty equipment, that could just be like corrosion, or sometimes it could be like someone leaving a hatch open or different things. The venting is, it's not as much of a problem now, but in the past, prior to our state rules, especially in the Permian Basin, since they were mostly looking at wanting the oil in the basin, then they would sometimes intentionally vent the gas because that wasn't the product that they were hoping to sell, or they didn't have the takeaway capacity with pipelines to sell it. And it just, to them, it was just easier to just vent it in the air. And sometimes venting still happens, and that could be like in emergencies, like a surge of pressure, among different things. And then flaring is a little bit better than venting just because the gas is still released into the atmosphere, but it's burned off, whereas venting is just directly letting it into the air. And so venting and flaring used to happen both for the same reason, because it wasn't the product they're looking for, or it's not the quality they're looking for. And there's other times and parts of the process when that occurs as well still. And then oil and gas is a little bit complicated. So most people are familiar with the oil and gas wells, especially in New Mexico, since we live in a production state. But there's also leaks and also different types of emissions that come all throughout the chain of oil and gas. And that is gathering lines. So there's like 3 different types of pipelines. And then there's like the gas processing plants, compressor stations. And then there's like, when you go further towards like the Gulf, for example, a lot of our Permian oil and gas ends up going to export terminals and like plastics and stuff like that. So it's like a massive system where there's leaks all along the way. And for all of these different sources, there's already technically proven, commercially available ways that they can reduce emissions. And in some instances, it could even be profitable for the companies because they are able to then sell this gas that they were previously just venting or flaring. And then this is a bit older, but an ICF 2014 report said that emissions could be cut by 40% for just 1 penny per 1,000 cubic feet of gas, just to give an idea of that this is something that's been available for a long time to industry, but they've just chosen not to, kind of like that whole profit dynamic. And then I wasn't able to find the current number, but in 2015, there were already 11 companies in New Mexico doing methane mitigation work. And there's likely much more now because it's more mainstream. And there's also federal and state rules that require some of it. So a lot of the time when decision makers approach methane emissions, they look at it as a waste of a shared resource and they look at it in terms of dollars. So this is from a MNERD, an Energy Mineral Natural Resource Department of New Mexico's report. And this is the estimated amount of vented and flared gas between 2011 and 2019. They estimated that this was a loss of state revenue between 10 to 200 million per year. So it's, I didn't get the actual figures for how much money the gas would have cost like consumers, but it's much higher than this. This is just how much royalty rates the state or didn't get to receive because of this waste. And based off of the total for 2019, this was enough gas wasted to power over half of the homes in the state. And that's using the average of 71.54 MCF a year. So methane, while methane doesn't directly cause health impacts, it's emitted alongside other co-pollutants that do, such as ground level ozone, which is also referred to as smog, and soot-forming pollutants called volatile organic compounds. And there's also other toxic pollutants such as cancer-causing benzene. The VOCs from oil and gas have been known to worsen asthma, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, and as well as having adverse impacts to the central nervous system, eyes, skin, respiratory tracts, liver, kidney, endocrine systems. And the longer and closer you are, whether it's living, working, or going to school near these facilities, the greater the risk is. These are also some of the other pollutants that are emitted with oil and gas, and some of them like specific cancers that are listed as like leukemia for benzene, or there's like birth defects, as well as like hormonal changes and cognitive impairment, impacts to the lungs. And then also just to know, a lot of these chemicals are toxic, explosive, and they could be fatal at high levels. So there was also there's been a report that a group of public health experts have done every year since 2014. In the most recent iteration in October, they found that there was even more scientific, medical, government, and media reports supporting the idea that fracking a specific type of oil and gas has an array of negative impacts to human health. They found 2,500 papers that add to this evidence. And they also noted that that is 6 times higher than the first time that they did this report in 2014, but all of the conclusions are the same across the papers. And the document that compiles references to all of those papers is 637 pages, so it's a very extensive document. And when I share these slides, articles are hyperlinked, so people are more than welcome to get more information. And so to look at New Mexico specifically, there are just under 78,000 oil wells and just under 47,000 gas wells in New Mexico. And I wanted to highlight, could you still see my screen since I changed tabs?
Yep.
Okay, so I will zoom into both basins just to show you how concentrated it is. So essentially it's almost well on top of well. In this picture, I believe it's, so green is oil wells and red is gas wells. So it's just, they're right. And the yellow ones have approved permits, but aren't currently active yet. So that's the Permian. And then in the San Juan Basin, it's also pretty heavy. And a lot of our public lands, I believe the last time I looked, it was something like 97 to 98% of available public lands is already leased. And despite that, there are still sometimes quarterly lease sales that continue to go on and lease more land. So essentially, there's almost no public land that isn't leased, at least at the federal level in New Mexico. Some of you may have heard of the oil and gas threat map. It has a lot of other information, but the information I pulled out from it is that there are over 144,000 people that live within a half mile, which is what they're referring to as the threat radius of wells, compressors, processors, and half of those people in New Mexico are people of color. There's 119 schools in this radius, and then there's this around the heavy infrastructure. It's just under 8,800 square miles. So there's been some also, so this is also referencing a International Energy Agency's Fall 2023 report. They looked at on the global level that methane emissions are expected to increase by up to 13% through 2030. And earlier I had referenced there that they believe it's vital that we have a 75% methane reduction in oil and gas, and half of emissions from coal they can be abated with existing technology at low costs. They found that immediate methane cuts from the fossil fuel industry could prevent nearly 1 million premature deaths. That most of the deaths that they were attributing it to relate to ozone exposure by mid-century. And reducing the methane emissions could also avert 90 million metric tons of crop losses and about 85 billion hours of lost labor due to heat exposure. That's not counting missed school days and so forth. And they also estimated that the negative impact of having all this methane results in a $260 billion in direct, or mitigating the methane would be a $260 billion in direct economic benefits. So to move on to a bit of polling. This one's a bit older. I'll go to the more recent State of the Rockies poll that they do every year. This one is from 2016, and New Mexico's been included since 2014, but since then they've added a few more states. They only poll Western states, and they found that 80% of people in the West support the BLM efforts to reduce methane pollution, 2-to-1 supported methane action in New Mexico, 3-to-1 in Oklahoma. And they found that in the West, that 76% of Republicans in Western states and nearly 80% of all registered voters supported cutting methane on public lands. Methane waste. So their more recent report, this is from their 2023 report that was released at the end last fall. In New Mexico, 94% of the people in the poll supported requiring oil and gas companies to reduce leaks. 91% supported oil and gas companies to pay for cleanup and restoration after drilling is finished. So this kind of relates to the growing number of like abandoned wells and that sort of thing. And then the top one is 72% of people in New Mexico were supportive of transitioning to 100% clean renewable energy over the next 10 to 15 years. And then 65% believed that oil and gas drilling has a serious negative impact on our land, air, and water. So there's been many different organizations that have been working on methane for 10 plus years. And that's a mix of different ways from media to doing like in-person events or webinars, as well as like directly pressuring and meeting with elected officials or decision makers at agencies. And from that, I'm going to get into, there's a bunch of different methane rules that have happened in the last few years. So we have two state rules that were finalized. I have the date wrong, it's 2022. That included a plan to reduce methane pollution from the oil and gas industry by doing things like leak detection and repair, reducing venting and flaring. Part of the IRA is something called the Methane Emission Reduction Program, and that includes a methane fee where it charges operators a fee for excess emissions. And then the EPA finalized methane rules. And this is the first time that federal rules have applied to existing infrastructure. And then I'll also talk a bit about the BLM waste rule and some other federal rules. So an important thing to know is that all of these different agencies approach the issue a little bit differently. So for example, New Mexico Environment Department, NMED, and the EPA, they approach methane as an air quality or climate perspective, whereas the Oil Conservation Division, OCD, in New Mexico, and the federal BLM, they look at it more as a waste issue, money that the government would otherwise receive through royalties. So they have two different approaches. So their rules are a bit different, but they all impact the way industry is regulated. So the first of the New Mexico rules that I'll talk about is the OCD methane waste prevention rule. This one, it was finalized in April 2021, but they didn't start collecting data until February 2022. It requires industry captures 98% of their gas by 2026. It prohibits routine flaring and it incentivizes advanced leak detection technology. OCD did an analysis of the first 1.5 years of data, and they found that of the 1,600 facilities in New Mexico, 20 of them were responsible for 30% of all reported venting and flaring. And then unfortunately, in October, there was some press that came out that was looking at the way that the rules have rolled out. And they found that only half of New Mexico's operators are following the state air pollution rules. And that was from July 2022 through July 2023. So there wasn't, so with the 50% compliance rate, there's still a lot of work to do. And then earlier this year, the agencies have said that they estimated that the flaring and venting rules have reduced flaring and venting in New Mexico by 30%. And that the agency currently believes the biggest challenge is takeaway capacity for midstream operators. So that's something they're working on, and they're hoping that they'll get even greater compliance. So the next rule is the NMED ozone precursor rule, finalized July of 2022. It doesn't regulate methane directly, but it goes after those co-pollutants, such as the volatile organic compounds, the VOCs, which earlier, as mentioned, are attributed to a lot of the health impacts. And the rule also targets nitrogen oxides and carbon monoxide for reductions. And it also required the tracking of fugitive emissions. This rule is currently being challenged in court. Okay, and then at the federal level, the big rule, the EPA methane rule, it was finalized this last March. And the EPA estimates that from now until 2038, the standards would reduce methane from the sources in the rule by 80%. And this rule also was challenged pretty promptly by industry and some red states. And New Mexico's Attorney General Torres joined a letter with 19 others to defend this rule in court. So I thought that was a great thing to mention. And so a little bit about this rule. It takes a stronger look at flaring and associated gases than we expected, so that's great. It completely bans flaring at new wells in 2 years and puts some restrictions on existing wells. It includes emission control devices, and it also has like a 1 year grace period, which the idea is that that would help protect it legally, since it's not as much of a burden for industry since they give them that grace period. The rule also includes comprehensive leak monitoring requirements, and it also has like increased regular inspections for all sites, including low producing and inactive sites. And then if a producer uses a technology or equipment that's known to be failure prone or otherwise leaky, then they are required to do quarterly inspections of the equipment. And for just the EPA rule, the Blue-Green Alliance found that the methane rule would create 136,000 new good-paying jobs through 2035. And the median wage in the methane mitigation sector is over $30 an hour, 60% higher than the US average. And they also had kind of polled different industry firms, and 75% of manufacturing, 88% of service firms said that they would create more jobs if the national methane standards were implemented. And then in the methane mitigation space, there's a lot of blue collar jobs like mechanical, electrical engineers, technicians, welders. And then there's also like other jobs such as financial analysts, sales managers, and nearly 60% of all of these firms are considered small businesses. There's over 225 firms that manufacture the technologies or provide services to reduce methane pollution, and almost all of them are headquartered in the US. There is over 1,000 US locations where there are methane mitigation firms located. And then in 2015, so I'm not sure where we currently rank, but we at the time were ranked 10th in the nation for employee locations relevant to the methane mitigation sector. So onto some of the other rules. So then also in April, there's the BLM waste rule that was finalized that bans routine venting and flaring. It's weaker than the EPA rule, but it goes into effect for new sources sooner. So these rules will be able to work and complement each other. The EPA rule is going to apply to all land. So it will supersede the BLM rule. And in places the EPA rule is stronger, it will supersede our state rules. When this rule was being drafted, the BLM reported that in 2019 alone, oil and gas operators vented or flared 150 billion cubic feet of methane, which is equivalent to $400 million worth of natural gas on federal and tribal lands, enough to power the needs of 2.1 million households, which is the same as the number of households in New Mexico, North Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming combined. And of that $400 million of natural gas, they estimated that that is a loss of $50 million in federal royalty revenue, and half of the federal royalty money goes to the states. And this royalty money from oil and gas goes to pay for things like education, infrastructure, health and emergency service, and general local government budgets. Some of the other federal rules that are also important to be aware of if you're follow methane is the BLM onshore oil and gas rule. That one raises the royalty rates, increases the minimum leasing bids, and it eliminated non-competitive leasing, and it increased the minimum bond amounts for BLM land. Then there's the BLM public lands rule, which encourages balanced management. It added conservation on equal footing with some of the other types of land use. And then the EPA power plant rule, which was also finalized in April, limits emissions from new and existing coal plants and new natural gas plants. And then it's expected that they're going to, in the next year or two, work on supplementary rules for existing gas power plants. And then a rule that we've been still waiting on, they've already had all of their meetings, but they haven't finalized it yet. We're hoping they finalize it by the end of the year, is the Department of Transportation's pipeline rule. And that one requires leak detection repair for millions of miles of gas transmission, distribution, and gathering lines, underground gas storage facilities, LNG facilities. Historically, as far as the pipelines go, leaks were allowed to persist for years if it wasn't considered quote unquote hazardous. So this is a major change that they're going to require repairs. And then as part of the IRA, two things that are relevant to this space is the methane emission reduction program that I mentioned earlier. So this year, industry is tracking emissions and they'll be charged for 2024 emissions in next year in March of 2025. And this, the methane emission fee, that applies to not just the production area, but it applies to all throughout the oil and gas industry. So that's like the midstream, some downstream. There are a few exceptions, but it goes much further than some of the other rules because it applies to such a vast part of the sector. And from this program, there has also been different grant opportunities at the federal level. New Mexico has already received 14 million to improve methane measurement and enforcement. That money has not been spent yet, but that is, and then there's also supposed to be a second round of more funds from the federal government to help with this. And then another part of the IRA was the greenhouse gas reporting program, and that was finalized in May. There's new formulas to calculate emissions, which is a great thing. So this impacts more than just the oil and gas sector. And emissions at large have been vastly underreported. There's multiple studies. EDF has one that's more specific to the Permian, but the one I included in here is that Nature had published a report about emissions are 3 times higher nationally than what is reported to the EPA. And some of that is using like satellite imagery or other types of technologies to see how high emissions actually are. And they estimated that the true cost of these emissions was over 9.3 billion in annual climate damages. And then the last rule that I wanted to mention, this one isn't directly related to methane, but it's still an important rule, is the Securities and Exchange Commission's climate rule, which would require companies to disclose some emissions and climate-related information to the public. So this could be from their operations, it could be like some of their investments and that sort of thing. It got severely watered down from what was initially proposed 2 years ago. But despite that, it still has been challenged in court. So it's currently going through what's expected to be a lengthy legal battle. So what's next? So the next thing that we are looking towards is the state implementation plan for the EPA methane rule. The state has 2 years to complete this plan, and part of that is filling the gaps between the EPA rule and our state rules. One thing to be a little hesitant about is that the smog or federal haze rule, our state implementation plan for that has been stalled. It started in 2019 and it's now very delayed. EPA earlier this year gave New Mexico a notice for not submitting the plan on time, and their new deadline to get the plan in is this August. So we're kind of watching that process to see if that could shed light on what to expect for the EPA rule. There are some differences between the EPA rule and the state rules. So for one thing, like our ozone rule doesn't directly target methane. How I said mentioned earlier, it's like VOCs, NOx, and carbon monoxide. So they would just need to add methane to those regulations, and then it would be in compliance with the EPA rule. And then some of the other differences are the state is stricter, which is so anywhere the state's stricter, then we don't have to change anything, but it's still important to know. The state's stricter on leak detection and repair for large facilities because we require monthly inspections. EPA requires quarterly. And then our New Mexico has proximity requirements, which the EPA does not. So that means more frequent inspections for facilities that are near more people. And then our state rules are stronger on flaring, but weaker on temporary venting because our state had more exceptions for the venting. So a fix there would just be to remove some of those exceptions, and then we would be in compliance. And then the EPA also has alternative technologies options. So that would be like if an industry installs a continuous methane emission monitor, then they could get less frequent inspections. So there's little things like that, like having alternative pathways the EPA rule has that our state does not. And then other areas like the EPA is stronger on retrofit requirements for pneumatic controllers. And also our state does not have any leak detection or repair requirements for natural gas compressors, only for what they call wet seal compressors, which are more related to oil. So that's another area that we would probably just adopt the EPA standard, or the state could come up with their own. And then the EPA is also stricter on facilities with no electricity. They base it on having no electricity and at least 3 pumps is where they have requirements, whereas New Mexico has a blanket exemption for facilities if they don't have electricity, regardless of the number of pumps that they have. So aside from that, I will share this link in the chat. This is not directly related to methane, but something that currently a lot of partners are working on is they just filed a petition to improve bonding reform in New Mexico. And we have a petition to tell the New Mexico Oil Conservation Commission that we want oil and gas operators to pay more to clean up their toxic pollution. So this is like increasing the amount of money they give in the event that a well becomes orphaned or abandoned. And oftentimes when wells are left that way, taxpayers have to pay to clean up the site. And it often takes a really long time because there's such a huge backlog of facilities that need to be properly shut down and cleaned up. And I didn't include in here, but like abandoned wells and orphaned wells, they often still leak methane and benzene even if they're shut in. And it also, there's like the risk that some of the pollution could seep into the groundwater depending on how old the site is. So I will share this link. And I encourage people to follow this rulemaking. That we'll probably get a date later in the year to when it's going to take place. Ready for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Antoinette. That was a lot of information in a very short time.
Yeah, I'm sorry that there wasn't many
No.
images. It was very.
I guess I would just ask a question, and that is for you to back up a little bit and give us kind of an overview. It's clear to me from what you tell us that both the number and severity or tightness of the rules is ramping up seriously on the industry. This has taken, those of us have been watching, this has taken way too long. But the next question is, are these goals, considering what we understand about the resources both at the federal and state level, are these goals realistic? And if they're not, what can we do?
So they are. I feel like they could have been a lot stronger. A lot of these rules, they include existing technology that's been on the market for a while. So some of it requires upgrades to facilities. And then a lot of the focus of almost all of these rules is just leak detection and repair. Oftentimes leaks are just left to go for long periods of time. And that's where a big portion of the emissions that they're trying to capture are. And then some of it is also just like making sure that gas is captured instead of just vented or flared. But a lot of these things are already commercially available. It just is like the willpower. And a lot of these rules work together. So I didn't say this, but the EPA methane rules, while they're finalized, they're not going to be in effect for 2 to 3 years. And in the meantime, the methane fee from the methane emission reduction program, we're hoping that that will be an incentive for industry to avoid paying the fee, to just pay for the upgrades that they need to do anyways to reduce some of this pollution sooner.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I
And
was a little discouraged. And so I'm glad there's some room for guarded optimism. Tom, do you have some other questions out of the chat for us?
Yes, there's a few. Athena was quite busy posting questions in the chat. I'm going to pick a few of them. So starting at the top, wondering whether the leakage from abandoned wells is included in the leakage data for the state of New Mexico. Do you know that, Antoinette?
so let me see. So for the state emissions, I believe it is, but it's likely underreported because especially like on some of the tribal land, there's been a need for more mapping because some of these older legacy wells, they're not even on maps sometimes. So most of the data, is from reported emissions. So in New Mexico, a lot of the time we rely on industry self-reporting. But I do believe that they have done flyovers and that type of thing where there is some other empirical data in, but so some abandoned wells are in it, but probably not all of them.
Thank you. Here's another one, maybe topical with what's in the news. Are there any fires in New Mexico anywhere near the existing oil and gas wells? Thinking Ruidoso, the South Fork and Salt fires, and maybe some others of the state. Or have we seen an impact of wildfires interacting with existing wells?
I'm not positive on that one. That's a really good question, though.
Yeah, I can't think of any news reporting, but boy, the potential exists to ignite that stuff, doesn't it?
So I've seen some fires, but it didn't catch on to brush and stuff like that. So there has been fires from leaks, and usually it's like a couple of days burning till they put it out. But they're kind of more similar to like chemical fires. But I wouldn't discount it. I guess it just depends on the terrain.
Yeah, yeah.
And then
So-
for the non-compliance question,
Yeah, go ahead.
the state has done, they have issued a couple of fines and warnings, but they haven't used their enforcement authority as much as we had hoped. A lot of the time they are doing warnings or asking operators how long does it take, or how long will it take for you to be online and that sort of thing. And they've charged some penalties though.
But it's not as though they try to calculate how much venting or leakage occurred and then total that up and say, okay, here's the bill for what you need to pay to the state based on the backlog of how much you wasted. They don't do
No, they don't try to capture the lost royalties, which is a shame because that'd probably be a lot of money.
a lot of money. Yeah.
So that was just, if I break in, so there was a reform to the Oil and Gas Act introduced into the last legislative session. And that was one of the changes, was to make the industry liable for the leaks. In other words, move the meter to the wellhead rather than where it is now, which is a ways away from the wellhead, so that it doesn't capture the quantity of leaked gas. And as we know, the industry fought tooth and nail to gut that piece of legislation, and it didn't pass.
Yes, indeed. In fact, there was a good story in today's press. What was it, ProPublica, Steffi? About that. If you want to find that link and stick it in the
I
chat.
put it in.
You put it in the chat? You just
Yeah.
did. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would that suggest people are interested in this topic. So the ProPublica article was an overview of the problem with trying to pass legislation to control industry abuses. And it looked at New Mexico specifically, and it was very instructive as to what the problem is. I'm not sure it was instructive as to what we do about it. But it's worth a read for sure.
So a couple of folks have their hands up. I'm going to first go to Athena and see if there's any of the other questions that you posted that you'd like to highlight and get an answer to, and then I'll turn to Walter. Athena, you want to come off mute?
Yeah, I think I'd actually like to talk about the last one. Somebody pointed out that there are strict timelines for lease approvals, and so oftentimes the workers will be inspecting wells and have to go back in the afternoon to make sure that they get approvals done, rather than even considering regulation enforcement, so they don't end up actually inspecting wells for 5 or 6 years. Yet those leases just have to go through. Or permits, one or the other. I
What's
forget.
your question?
Yeah.
It might even be permits.
Yeah, permits.
Yeah, so that is a problem. There's not, even when the agency had gotten a little bit more funding. So that's something also we do. We always try to advocate for more funding for the enforcement agencies. Even with some of that funding, they weren't able to fill all of their vacancies. They don't have that many inspectors. So yes, facilities are not inspected as often as they should be. In these rules, there is a requirement that they're inspected at a more frequent basis, but it's not really clear how the agency plans on doing that. Is it going to be remote? Is it going to be someone physically going by? Those are things that we're still waiting to see how they roll out. And then one thing that was a little bit disappointing, but it's still kind of progress, is part of the EPA rule. They had created a super emitters program, which allows third parties to report things. And the only problem is that they made it so that the only way to be in certified third party is you have to have like a satellite, like a methane satellite, like EDF just launched, or you have to do aerial surveys with planes. And they're not accepting some of the more on the ground technology for the third party certifications. And the difference there is that if you're third party certified and you report a large emission event, then the operator is required to do something about it. They get like a notice. Whereas if someone else reports it, sometimes they don't really take action. Like I believe Earthworks has submitted over like 200 complaints, and there's been action on maybe like a dozen or two. So there is that disparity between how to get enforcement, because even though we do have our flaring and venting rules, for some people that live in the Permian, they've actually reported seeing more flaring and venting now than in years past. So there is that discrepancy between, yes, we have good rules, but if they're not being enforced, what does that really mean?
Thank you. Thank you, Antoinette. Thanks, Athena. Walter, you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Antoinette, great presentation, really interesting and informative. But I have this feeling that we're kind of fiddling around with these little details when the elephant in the room is that we continue to mine these horrible things that are killing the planet. So it seems to me that we need to just shut down oil and gas. Let me be perfectly frank. And what are the prospects of doing that?
Sadly, it's not likely. So we're also a Keep It in the Ground organization. But we kind of have this dual approach where even though ideally we would just like no new permits and no more leasing, that we at least want them to be more accountable. Some of that is through different things, such as making it more expensive to do business. And that could be like making sure that industry is paying those higher bonds to cover the cleanup and all that. And some of it is like removing some of the federal subsidies and removing like state subsidies for oil and gas to make it less profitable in a sense, because industries had record profits year after year, even throughout COVID. The Permian Basin is the only basin that continued to get record profits year after year and never saw that decline. And it seems like part of the issue is that the US also, when we opened up to do exports, that's part of that was because forecasts had shown that US demand it's staying the same and in some instances even declining. So opening up exports is kind of like an artificial way to raise prices and keep prices high. And so that's also been a huge issue. And then there's also just like massive build out like in the Gulf Coast. And now I've also been working on, they're proposing a pipeline that will go from the Permian under the Rio Grande across Mexico to export from that side to Asia. So it's really difficult, especially since it's like a global issue now.
Right. So just one follow-up, and thank you. I agree with what you're saying, but I think it's really important for the Sierra Club just to state the blinding truth that we need to keep it in the ground and not get too wound up in details of flaring and venting and such. You know, not to minimize your hard work, but we just need to be very clear on our position.
Yeah, one thing that's really helped is like for the BLM lease sales, well, the other agencies aren't quite like this. We do protests every lease sale, and that's just getting signatures of people opposing it. The BLM has to respond to every single protest. So in some cases, it's delayed a lease sale for like a year and a half. But again, that's like a stall tactic. They're still getting their lease.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. One of the things, two aspects of the same problem. You talked, Antoinette, about the lack of enforcement personnel at the state level, or principally. And we had an opportunity, some of us on this Zoom, to talk with Mimi Stewart, who's a Senate Pro Tem, and it's more complicated than I understood, because we've been trying to get appropriations improved for the agency's inspection staff. What she told us was a huge roadblock is that because of the state personnel office rules, the agencies can't pay competitive wages. So when they're trying to hire a petroleum industry engineer, you know, and let's say, I don't know the exact numbers, but that they can pay $85,000 a year. The truck drivers in the Permian are making 50% more than that. And so Senator Stewart and her staff are in the process, I think, of studying this problem now and to see how to break the stranglehold of the state personnel office on these pay rates, the pay scales. So that's an interesting thing. The other thing I wanted to mention is that because the state agencies have been short on inspection staff, they are talking about relying more on technology to help them. And one of the technologies is satellite imaging. One of the rules they need to enforce is venting, flaring requirements. They have to get rid of flaring. And it's always interesting to me when you had a picture of that flare. I'm not sure where that was taken, but one of the problems is with flares is they're not maintained. So if you can see a flare, and it's all the time in the press, if you see a flare with a yellow flame like that one, it's not burning correctly. If a flare, and so that means that it's still leaking methane. It's burning some of the methane, but not it's not complete combustion. And a flare essentially is supposed to convert methane to CO2. But that's kind of a side point. On the industry is not just standing around twiddling their thumbs or just going to court. So they're developing technology which will allow them to build flares that are not detectable from satellites. In other words, the flames are shielded in some way that the satellites can't see them. And I don't know exactly what it's about. So this is a whole cat and mouse game. And this is on top of, I did some work with the MNerd database, which is a really vast quantity of information and it has a lot of interesting stuff on it. But when the state just a few years ago required that the industry report their venting and flaring, and specifically their flaring, the compliance for that reporting was only 50%.
There is another issue with it too. I don't know if you saw this, but a lot of industry was just reporting that they had 100% gas capture rate, which is technically not feasible. So those that reported that, they were able to be like, wait, that's not right. But if someone was falsifying that with, oh, we're already at the 98% capture rate, it's not as verifiable. But the ones that kind of said the 100% were telling on themselves. So that's also kind of brings into question, the state says that they're at over 90% of industry is at the 98% capture rate, but without some third-party verification, we won't truly know that.
Right. What
Why don't
else?
we ask if anybody else has a question? If you do, just put your virtual hand up and we'll call on you and see if there are any other audience questions people want to ask.
I think one of the things that jumps out to me, Antoinette, from your presentation was some of the polling numbers you showed. And the discrepancy between what the public is interested in seeing their legislators do and what is actually happening.
Was there a particular one?
Just across the board, you know, that like Walter said, I mean, we probably most of us on this call seem to understand that the real solution is to phase out oil and gas production. But let's say just in terms of stricter enforcement and regulation.
You can't see me.
Doing things like putting up bonding requirements.
Oh no, raise your hand.
Et cetera, et cetera. So how do we get from here to there? And I would just urge everybody on this call and going forward to participate as much as you're able in the legislation. I know the Sierra Club does a big effort to get people up to lobby, and Santa Fe and 350 New Mexico does as well. So we can't just let the industry has something like 15 full-time lobbyists in Santa Fe. We just can't let them have the total run of the roundhouse.
So this is also true for rulemaking. So outside the session, there's also some interim committee meetings. Usually if there's a topic, sometimes if you contact the chair in advance, they'll let you know if they're gonna allow public comment or not. And that could be virtual and sometimes in
How
person.
about this, Wendy?
And then there's also rulemaking. So for example, when we were having the ozone rulemakings, you could tell that industry were paying their workers just to fill the room. They weren't speaking or anything, but they were all there in uniform. And it's like an intimidation tactic. And oftentimes in some of those communities, it makes people that do care about the issue not feel comfortable speaking. So, but it is very important where even if you aren't comfortable talking in person, to at least send a message, which might feel a little bit more anonymous, to voice your position on some of the efforts that are going on.
Okay. Antoinette, I think we have someone on the call would like to ask a question. George, Jurasek, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you,
Yes.
George.
Good. I'm a former professor at UNM, and at the times when I was there active, we were, various activities of one thing or another, but with the federal labs, we were doing geothermal. I was on the governor's committee on geothermal. I'm wondering if academics here in New Mexico, and for that matter, the federal labs, are involved with some of what's going on, obviously, with the industries that you've described. And by the way, highest marks for you. Your presentation was very, very detailed. But again, are we missing something, or are there people at the universities, including Socorro, involved with any of this at this time? That's my question.
So I'm not actually positive. A lot of this is older technology. So it's been around for 10, 15 years. So there's not as much federal investment in it. They do still give some grant money for universities to pursue to make new technology that's even better than what's already on the market. I know that right now there's a lot of federal money that's looking at, so instead of the air pollution from oil and gas, there's a lot of Department of Energy and USDA and even EPA funding that's going towards produced water research. So that's the wastewater from oil and gas. So I'm sure there's likely similar programs for the air pollution, but since it's so much further down the road, a lot of the technology is already on market and there's already like a plethora of options that are the cost has already come down. Like it's not new technology anymore. They just haven't been implementing it.
Well, continue what you're doing and increasing the effort by bringing in others as well, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How about if we go to Steffi?
Hi, Antoinette. I was listening to the Legislative Finance Committee meeting last week, or the week before, I can't remember anyway. And of course, it was in Carlsbad, and it was populated by a lot of representatives from the oil and gas areas. And they were talking about setbacks, which is, is part of the Oil and Gas Reform Act. They had one scientist there who kept saying there's no scientific basis for setbacks. For any particular amount of setbacks. And there was somebody on the other side that wasn't speaking as definitively, but I'm wondering for this coming legislative session, how prepared are we going to be for the oil and gas reform to have, scientists who will.
So the advocates actually did have a scientist willing to speak of their research in support of setbacks, but the chair wouldn't allow them to speak and didn't give them any time. They still submitted a massive report about the science of the setbacks to the committee, but they weren't given any time. So the hope is that in the legislative session, there's not as many restrictions as the interim committees have, so that they would be able to talk. But yeah, that was disappointing.
And at the very end, they said, any public comment? No, okay, we're done. It's like that fast.
Yeah, and that was kind of a compromise. The chair said that he would allow public comment, but it didn't seem like he wanted to.
No.
Jim and then Athena. Jim, you're in mute.
I'm sorry, Athena, why don't you go ahead? I'm gonna wrap up at the end.
Okay, I just wanted to address what George was asking about with any sort of developments at any of the universities. I do know of one company, TS Nano, that has developed out of UNM, and they are in the process of scaling up their design, manufacture, and application of polymer nano composite sealants to prevent greenhouse gas emissions. So they are
Yes, I've heard
getting
that.
out there. We just need to encourage it.
A good thing. Thanks, Athena. So Jim, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, so just I think this has been a fascinating evening. I've been looking forward to it for some time because the ground is shifting under us in terms of new regs, and so we have to be up to speeds because the next game, of course, is enforcement. And I didn't want the evening go by without announcing the fracking tour that 350 is sponsoring. So this is called the Fracking Reality Tour. And this is maybe the third time we've done this, but it's been a while. And so what this is a field trip where you go out to northwestern New Mexico, and you get people who live in the area out there giving you a tour of the oil and gas facilities in their neighborhood, and you can see what it's like, what the effects are. I mean, it's, you know, the statistics are awful, but talking to people who are actually living next to these things, when you ask about a fire, well, yeah, so this well over here exploded, you know, next door to my house 3 years ago, and they wouldn't even tell me when it happened. We just had to get out, you know, kind of. I mean, it's just really powerful if you've got the time. It's on a Saturday on July 13th, and we're organizing carpools. And if you want to sign up, because we have a very limited amount of people who can go, if you want to sign up, if you're on our mailing list, 350 New Mexico mailing list, I just sent out an email this morning about it, or you can reserve a spot by emailing tour, TOUR, at 350newmexico.org and get on
Just
board.
put that in the chat, Jim.
Yes, I will do that. And it's really an interesting way to engage with this on a very personal level. And when you talk to people, it's one thing to say, well, I heard on this speaker series all this stuff, but it's another thing when you say, well, I talked to Daniel, who lives next to a well, and he told me that his kids had to be on a bus for an hour and a half to Cuba because the parents were so concerned about the pollution from the well next to their school. They didn't want the kids going to school there. So anyhow, I hope some of you can join us on that, and I will put the reservation email in the chat. Does anybody else have any last words?
So will we receive this presentation? I found it very informative.
Yes, there's a lot of good reference material in there and background. Tom does that thankless job of converting this video into something he can upload. And it, what is it, a week or 10 days, Tom?
So by the end of this week. So yeah, Antoinette has promised to provide the slides to me, and when the video is ready to upload, I'll send a link to the video along with Antoinette's slides to the folks who signed up for today's call.
Another thing you can do right now, if you want to hold on to some of this information, if you open up your chat window, I don't know if you know how to save the chat. So you can save the chat on your computer. You open up the chat window, and up in the upper right-hand corner are 3 dots. If you click on the 3 dots, it gives you an option to save the chat, and that will save a text document onto your hard drive for your computer. And that way you can have access to all the hyperlinks and everything that are in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? Any technical issues? All right, Antoinette, I don't think we've ever met. I look forward to meeting you at the Roundhouse someday, raising hell, telling them what they should do. And thank you everybody for attending tonight, and thank you, Tom, for helping out.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. Great presentation. Really appreciate it.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.